So you have brought us to the next place we need to explore, which is the double effect. So talk to me about this notion
Right.
of the guardrails and how the double effect impacts your day-to-day practice.
Right. So, the double effect meaning in very simple terms, and boy, you've got a much more eloquent way of describing that, I know from your background. But in my mind, what that means is it's all about intention
Hmm.
and about being explicit. So I am intentional in my easing your pain, um, with the explicit intention not to make you die by the medicine I give you. And I do share this with every patient I talk with, because I know sometimes they think, oh, Horowitz is, I know what you're doing. You're starting the drip. We know where that leads. Well, no, where it leads, I hope, is to less pain, less suffering, and whatever degree of clarity you can have with, and I'm talking generous, big doses of opioids. Somebody who's opioid naive, it may not take a lot. Somebody
Hmm.
who's had a lot of opioids, it might take a lot. We may not even be able to get there with a massive dose like
Right.
those described in the Husel case. The brainstem can be overwhelmed when people die of a clinician delivered dose of medicine because of shutting down the brainstem, or out in their home with a self IV'd dose of fentanyl or heroin or Vicodin.
Hmm.
The death is usually because it stops the brain stem's awareness of breathing. Breathing stops, people fall asleep and they die by not breathing. They don't experience suffocation.
You
No,
in effect forget to breathe.
yeah, and don't know they're not.
Right.
Unconsciousness ensues before the breathing stops in most cases, um, or a different degree of consciousness, probably. So, in the medical space, though, the Husel case is different than what we're talking about gradually increasing doses proportionate with your wishes as things change. That's in a particular case where somebody is on life support on a ventilator. And this is a different, just to be clear, this is a different policy
Hmm.
here. It's different guidelines than palliative sedation or pain management. This is stopping life-sustaining treatment, artificial life support, with the recognition that removing a breathing tube in someone who needs it to keep living will cause suffocation. And I will not allow my patient to suffocate to death.
Hmm.
Um, so in a case in which we know they can't breathe without the tube, and we have some good pre-removal tests for that, when we know they won't be able to breathe without the tube, we know they're going to not breathe enough to survive. We know that if we don't treat them with medicines, they will suffer through that agony for minutes to hours or longer. That's a case where using medicines, opioids, and benzodiazepines, typically mostly in combination, in anticipation of removing the tube until they're comfortable, and then in reaction to how they respond, will make that dying um, a peaceful one,
Hmm.
right?
So this is the notion of oxygen starvation, right? You don't want patients to experience that hunger, that need for oxygen.
Well, right, and it's not even the oxygen; it's the movement of the air.
Hmm.
It's the trying to breathe through a straw. Your oxygen level is going to be fine for quite some time, but try to breathe through a straw and then a narrower straw and then pinch it, and imagine how long you could do that, and imagine there's no out.
Hmm.
You will eventually starve for air, and yes, ultimately oxygen, carbon dioxide will go up. Awful, awful way to go. So yeah, so we can treat that if
Hmm.
we know that that's the medical situation that's forthcoming.
So what we're talking about here in ethical terms is the difference between first order objectives and second order impacts, right? When you give any medication, whether it's fentanyl or morphine or any of the sedatives, you know that you're doing it to achieve one effect. That's your first order intended effect. You know that it can, and in some cases will produce a second order effect. And this is where we run into one of those homonym problems, right?
Mhm.
Because the word intend or intent has to mean two different things. You're intending to administer the drug, so that's one kind of intent. You know that it will produce the first order effect, that's the one that you're shooting for. You also know that it will at some point produce the second order effect. So by intending to administer the medication, you're aware that there's a cause-effect relationship between what you're doing and the second order effect.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that you intended to end the person's life or even that you intended to introduce a cessation of respiration.
Mhm.
And to the extent that you are trying to achieve your first order effect and minimizing, but not making an effort to eliminate the second order effect, that's the ethical definition of the double effect.
Right.
And everyone doing this work needs to take that to heart.
Right. And I'd go just even a little bit further, is that that second order effect is not a foregone conclusion. That a lot of people who are extubated, are simply not going to breathe. The medication is not going to make them breathe less than nothing. They're going to breathe not at all. Somebody with ALS, a neuromuscular disease, somebody who's got a severe stroke who is not breathing, somebody who can't move air, the likelihood of their dying because of what's going on, the natural death will ensue when that tube comes out within minutes, likely in either case. And
Right.
so the opioid actually in those circumstances, and this is going to be impossible to prove in many cases, is
Mhm.
probably not going to accelerate their dying. And if it does, it's likely just in a short order. Now, there are cases in which it's not clear. There may be some breathing, and it may be difficult breathing. And this is a case in which I enter into a discussion with you, David, and I say to you, or about your loved one whom you're speaking for as surrogate, my commitment, here's a place where the guardrail, I will not allow your dad to struggle. I won't do it. And you can say, I don't like opioids. I'm not, we're against them. My brother
Right.
died of an opioid. I'm going to say, I will not allow that. I will give at least enough medicine that he is appearing, our best surrogate for how he's doing, appearing comfortable, not gasping.
Right.
And if your leaning is, I'd rather you just put him down, I have license to lean, a little bit more towards that generous end. And I don't use that word to trivialize it, but not with the intention of stopping his breathing.
Right. And that is where intention is so important, both ethically and legally in your work.
Yeah.
And we ought to footnote in this discussion the notion of medical humility, because, as you mentioned a moment ago, we're not always certain that a particular effect will occur. And we have our reminder in Karen Ann Quinlan, right? And that whole legal fight in New Jersey in the 70s, specifically because the doctors were so convinced, so confident that turning off the ventilator would be the equivalent of killing her. And it turned out that they were mistaken,
Right.
right?
Right.
So that needs to be part of our ethical discussion as well.
Yes. Right. So somebody in that condition, so if you stopped breathing on the basis of a pneumonia that has resolved, even if you suffered severe brain damage, but your brainstem is working and moving enough air, you might well live when we stop that tube. And we're going to have a discussion beforehand. And this is not a case in which I'm going to be providing those big doses of opiates. I'm going to give enough to make sure you look comfortable. We'll take out the tube, and you may have the misfortune, and it could be a tragic one, of living on in a way you never would have wanted to, breathing autonomously. And my job is not then to overcome that with medicine that stops your breathing, even if that would be your wish or your family's.